The October rain had been falling on Cambridge for 3 days straight, turning the cobblestones treacherous and filling Thomas Whitmore's small study with the particular dampness that made old paper smell like mushrooms. He didn't mind it, really. After 20 years of working with ancient manuscripts, the scent had become as familiar as pipe tobacco to other men. This morning found him bent over a 13th-century psalter, his magnifying glass revealing tiny Latin abbreviations that most scholars would have dismissed as decorative flourishes. But Whitmore knew better. Medieval scribes, he'd learned, were clever men trapped in tedious work, and they often amused themselves with hidden meanings. "Curious," he muttered, though no one was there to hear except Ptolemy, his gray tabby, who responded by stretching luxuriously across the very section of his reference book he needed. The cat had belonged to his late wife Helen, and 3 years after her passing it still claimed every patch of sunlight and every important document with equal authority. The letter arrived just as he'd decoded what appeared to be a rather scandalous joke about the monastery's abbot hidden in the illuminated border. Mrs. Findlay, his landlady, knocked twice, her signature rhythm that meant correspondence rather than complaint about the chemical smell from his photographic experiments. "Delivered by private messenger," she announced with the particular emphasis that meant she'd attempted to extract information from the poor fellow and failed. The envelope bore the Harrowby seal, pressed deep into burgundy wax. Lord Edmund Harrowby. Whitmore had catalogued part of the family's collection 5 years ago, back when he still held his position at the university, before the incident with the forged Bacon manuscript that had cost him his lectureship. Not his fault, that business, but academia rarely concerned itself with such distinctions. The Harrowbys had paid well then, and from the weight of this paper, they would again. The letter was brief, urgent, and curiously vague. Lord Harrowby required his expertise immediately for a matter of considerable delicacy regarding family documents of historical significance. A check for traveling expenses was enclosed, along with a first-class railway ticket for the afternoon train to Harrowby Hall. Whitmore held the check up to the dim light filtering through his rain-spotted window. It was more than he'd earn in 2 months of his current piecework. Whatever Lord Harrowby wanted decoded, it was either very important or very embarrassing. Possibly both. The train journey took him through the flat fenlands outside Cambridge, past fields being prepared for winter wheat. He brought along Professor Aldrich's latest letter to reread, though the jolting of the carriage made it difficult. Aldrich, one of the few colleagues who still corresponded with him, had stumbled upon something odd in Newton's private papers. Calculations that didn't match any known mathematical work, references to mechanical devices that shouldn't have existed in Newton's time. "Most peculiar," Aldrich had written, "as if our great Newton had access to designs from the future itself." Whitmore smiled at his friend's dramatic phrasing, though he'd learned never to dismiss Aldrich's hunches entirely. The man had an uncanny ability to spot patterns others missed, rather like Whitmore himself, which perhaps explained their continued friendship despite Whitmore's academic disgrace. Harrowby Hall appeared through the carriage window as the afternoon light began to fade, its Tudor bones evident despite Georgian additions and Victorian attempts at Gothic revival. The estate looked tired, Whitmore thought, like a grand dame who could no longer quite afford to keep up appearances. The decorative ironwork needed painting, and several windows on the upper floors were boarded rather than glazed. The footman who answered the door was young, perhaps 19, with the kind of sharp attention that suggested ambition beyond his station. "Mr. Whitmore, sir. His lordship is expecting you in the library." Following the boy through corridors lined with portraits of stern Harrowbys, Whitmore noticed the subtle signs of decline. Worn carpets carefully arranged to hide the worst patches, empty spaces on walls where paintings had been sold, gas fixtures that should have been converted to electricity by now in a house of this standing. The aristocracy, it seemed, was feeling the squeeze of changing times. Lord Harrowby had aged considerably in 5 years. His hands shook slightly as he rose from behind a desk covered in correspondence, and his face held the grayish pallor of a man who wasn't sleeping well. "Whitmore, thank God you've come." The greeting lacked the formal reserve of their previous encounters. "I need someone with your particular skills, someone who understands that not everything is as it appears." The library at Harrowby Hall possessed that particular quality of accumulated silence that only rooms full of unread books achieve. Dust motes danced in the last rays of October sunlight streaming through tall windows, and the air held notes of leather, old paper, and something else. Fear, perhaps, though Whitmore would have been hard-pressed to explain how fear could have a scent. Lady Margaret Harrowby entered with the rustle of black bombazine, her mourning dress a curious choice given that no one had recently died. At 38, she was nearly 30 years her husband's junior, with the kind of careful beauty that suggested significant effort each morning. Behind her came a younger man who could only be James, the heir. He had his father's jaw, but none of the old man's trembling uncertainty. "Mr. Whitmore," Lady Margaret began, her voice carrying a trace of Yorkshire beneath its cultivated tones. "We need your help with something rather unusual." Lord Harrowby gestured toward a corner of the library where a small table sat covered with a green baize cloth. "It's been in the family for generations. My great-grandfather Cornelius acquired it, or perhaps made it. The records are unclear." The footman from earlier, Simon, Whitmore had heard him called, appeared with a tea service, his movements precise, but his eyes constantly shifting toward the covered table. Whatever lay beneath that cloth, the entire household knew about it. When Lord Harrowby pulled away the covering, Whitmore found himself looking at what appeared to be a spirit board, though far more elaborate than the popular Ouija boards being sold in London shops. The wood was dark oak, inlaid with mother-of-pearl letters and numbers that seemed to glow in the dimming light. At its center sat a brass planchette shaped like a compass rose, its pointed end currently resting on the letter M. "3 times," Lord Harrowby said quietly, "it has moved on its own. 3 times it has spelled out predictions, and 3 times those predictions have come true." James made a sound of disgust. "Father, really?" "The fire in the East Wing on St. George's Day," Lady Margaret interrupted, her fingers worrying at her jet necklace. "It spelled out, 'Flames consume history,' 3 days before. Then Cousin Harold's accident in August, and the exact date. And last month?" "The bank failure," Lord Harrowby finished. "It named the very institution, the Northern Guaranteed Trust, a week before the collapse." Whitmore approached the board slowly, his trained eye taking in details. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. The inlay work alone would have taken months. The brass planchette was heavier than it looked, perfectly balanced on a central pivot that allowed it to move with almost no resistance. He noticed minute scratches on the wood, patterns that suggested regular movement along specific paths. "And now?" he asked, though something in Lord Harrowby's expression suggested he already knew the answer would be troubling. "2 weeks ago, it began moving again." The old man's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "It spelled out, 'Harrowby Falls, November 15. Nothing more, no matter how many questions we asked. November 15th, barely more than a fortnight away. "You want me to study your family archives," Whitmore said, understanding beginning to dawn. "You're hoping to find some historical precedent, some explanation that doesn't involve—" He gestured vaguely at the board. "I want you to prove it's a hoax," James said bluntly. "Someone in this house is playing an elaborate prank, probably hoping to drive Father into an early grave so they can claim inheritance." Lady Margaret's face flushed. "How dare you suggest—" "I'm suggesting nothing," James replied coolly. "But I'm also not believing in supernatural nonsense. This is 1894, not the Dark Ages." The Reverend Dunworthy arrived as they were arguing, a thin man with the kind of careful neutrality that came from years of navigating between faith and the cynicism of his educated parishioners. "Lord Harrowby, I came as soon as I received your note." Whitmore observed the family dynamics with professional interest, the son who wanted modernization, probably hemorrhaging money on some industrial venture, the young wife who'd married for position but found herself trapped in a dying estate, the patriarch clinging to dignity while his world crumbled, and underneath it all, genuine terror about this prophecy. Mrs. Blackwood, the housekeeper, appeared to announce that rooms had been prepared. She was a handsome woman of perhaps 48, with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. When she looked at the spirit board, Whitmore caught something in her expression, not fear exactly, but a kind of knowing sadness. "I'll begin with the archives tomorrow," Whitmore announced. "Tonight, I'd like to observe the board. Does it move at particular times?" "Midnight," Simon blurted out, then colored as everyone turned to stare. "That is, the staff have noticed. Midnight seems to be when—" "When the spirits are most active," Lady Margaret finished, and no one laughed. Whitmore spent the evening in his assigned room, reviewing what he knew about Cornelius Harrowby. The man had been something of an eccentric, a member of the Royal Society who'd corresponded with some of the great minds of his age. He died in 1794, exactly 100 years ago, which seemed too convenient to be coincidence. From his window, he could see the ruins of what had once been an observatory in the East Garden, its dome collapsed, its instruments long since removed or rotted away. Cornelius had been an amateur astronomer, among his other interests. The night was clear, and stars were beginning to appear, their light reaching across impossible distances to this troubled English estate. At 11:30, Whitmore made his way back to the library. He wasn't surprised to find he wasn't alone. James sat in a leather chair, a glass of brandy at his elbow, watching the board with the intensity of a cat at a mouse hole. Simon stood by the door, supposedly tending the fire, but clearly unwilling to miss whatever might happen. "You believe in none of this, yet here you are," Whitmore observed. James laughed bitterly. "I have investors visiting next week. If word spreads that Harrowby Hall is cursed, that prophecy says we're ruined." He didn't need to finish. In the current economic climate, perception could destroy a family as surely as any supernatural force. As midnight approached, Whitmore positioned himself where he could observe both the board and everyone in the room. The grandmother clock in the corner began its ponderous countdown. On the 10th chime, the planchette shivered. On the 11th, it began to move. The brass pointer glided across the board with deliberate purpose, pausing at each letter just long enough to be clearly read. T, I, M, E, R, U, N, S, S, H, O, R, T. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the movement stopped. The planchette sat innocent and still, as if it had never moved at all. But everyone in the room had seen it, and Whitmore had noticed something else, a barely perceptible vibration in the floorboards, a rhythm almost like clockwork that had accompanied the entire display. The morning of October 30th brought unseasonable warmth, one of those false autumn days that makes England feel briefly Mediterranean before winter reasserts itself. Whitmore had been up since dawn, working through the Harrowby archives with the methodical patience that had once made him Cambridge's most reliable paleographer. The family papers were stored in chronological boxes, though someone, probably a Victorian ancestor with too much time, had attempted to reorganize them by subject, creating a confusing overlap that required constant cross-reference. Cornelius Harrowby emerged from the documents as a man of contradictions. Here was a letter to Joseph Banks about botanical specimens from the Indies. There, a treatise on the mathematics of planetary orbits that showed genuine insight. But underneath the scholarly correspondence ran a current of bitterness that became more pronounced in his later years. "Found something interesting?" Mrs. Blackwood had entered the library so quietly that Whitmore hadn't noticed until she spoke. She carried a tray with tea and what appeared to be homemade biscuits, still warm from the oven. "Cornelius was disinherited, wasn't he?" Whitmore asked, accepting the tea gratefully. "Or nearly so." The housekeeper's face remained carefully neutral, but something flickered in her eyes. "The family doesn't speak of it much, sir. But yes, there was trouble between him and his father. Old Lord Harrowby, that would be the current lord's great-great-grandfather, thought Cornelius wasted too much time on his experiments." She set down the tray with practiced efficiency, but Whitmore noticed her fingers lingered on the wooden surface, tracing some pattern only she could see. "They say Cornelius locked himself in the East Wing for the last 5 years of his life, built all manner of strange contraptions." "The observatory was his, you know, before it burned." After she left, Whitmore turned his attention to Cornelius's personal journals. The handwriting was cramped, occasionally breaking into mathematical formulas or diagrams of mechanical devices. One entry from 1791 caught his attention. "They think me mad for pursuing the celestial mathematics, yet Newton himself walked these same paths of inquiry. Time, they fail to understand, is not a river, but a great clock, and those who comprehend its mechanisms might wind the spring to their own purposes." The reference to Newton resonated with Aldrich's letter. Whitmore made a note to wire his friend for more details about those anomalous calculations. Around midday, James Harrowby appeared, dressed in modern business attire that looked out of place among the library's ancient furnishings. "Any progress? Father's nerves are shredding." He spent the morning revising his will. "Your father seems to believe the prophecy," Whitmore observed. "But you mentioned investments. Surely a rational man like yourself." James laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I've sunk everything into a textile factory in Manchester. Modern machinery, efficient production. It should have been profitable, but there have been delays, accidents, labor troubles. If I can't secure additional funding by month's end..." He trailed off, staring at the spirit board, which sat innocent under its green cover. "Convenient timing for a prophecy of doom," Whitmore said carefully. "Convenient for whom?" James's voice turned sharp. "If you're suggesting I'm behind this theatrical nonsense, consider that I stand to lose everything if panic spreads. My potential investors are already nervous about lending to aristocracy. Add a curse to the mix?" He shook his head. "I'd be better off burning the damned thing." That afternoon, Whitmore discovered something peculiar in the household accounts from Cornelius's time. Regular payments to a clockmaker in London, one Josiah Whitehall, for specialized mechanisms and consultations. The sums were substantial, enough to build several grandfather clocks of the finest quality. Yet there was no record of such timepieces in the estate inventory. Young Simon appeared as Whitmore was puzzling over this discovery, ostensibly to tend the fire, but clearly eager to talk. "Mr. Whitmore, sir, might I ask, do you think it's real? The curse, I mean." The boy's anxiety was genuine, and Whitmore recognized something else in his expression, the look of someone with secrets of their own. "What do you think, Simon?" "I think—" The footman paused, choosing his words carefully. "I think sometimes things that seem supernatural have earthly explanations. But that doesn't make them less powerful, does it?"
If everyone believes a thing is cursed, doesn't that make it cursed in all the ways that matter? It was a surprisingly philosophical observation from a servant, and Whitmore filed it away as another puzzle piece. This household was full of people playing roles that didn't quite fit. That evening, Reverend Dunworthy joined them for dinner. The conversation danced around the prophecy until Lady Margaret, perhaps emboldened by wine, asked directly, "Reverend, is it possible? Can the dead speak to the living?" Dunworthy set down his fork with deliberate precision. "The Church teaches that such things are not for us to pursue, Lady Margaret. Yet I cannot deny that there are more things in heaven and earth." He paused, seeming to wrestle with himself. "Last year in Norwich, there was a medium who claimed to channel the voice of St. Augustine. Hundreds believed, gave money, changed their lives based on the spirit's pronouncements. Until a young scientist proved it was accomplished through hidden speaking tubes and an accomplice. The faithful were devastated. But what troubled me more was this. Some of what the false spirit said brought genuine comfort and moral improvement to those who heard it. Can a lie serve God's purpose? I find myself unable to answer. After dinner, Whitmore returned to the library alone, drawn by an idea that had been forming all day. The spirit board sat on its table, and he examined it again by lamplight. The planchette was beautifully balanced, responding to the slightest touch. But there was something else. When he pressed down on certain letters, he felt the faintest give in the wood, as if there were spaces beneath. He was about to investigate further when he heard footsteps in the corridor. Quickly covering the board, he pretended to be absorbed in a journal as Mrs. Blackwood entered. "Working late, sir?" She moved about the room, adjusting things that didn't need adjusting, her presence somehow both comforting and unsettling. "Mrs. Blackwood, you've been with the family long?" "All my life, sir. My mother was housekeeper before me." She paused at a portrait on the wall, Cornelius himself, painted in his prime, holding an astrolabe and looking directly at the viewer with intelligent, bitter eyes. "He was a brilliant man, they say. Too brilliant for his own good." "You speak as if you knew him." She smiled, a secret, sad expression. "Oh, no, sir. He died 100 years past. But in a house like this, the dead never quite leave, do they? Their choices echo forward, shaping lives they never knew would exist. After she departed, Whitmore remained staring at Cornelius's portrait, thinking about time and clockwork, about prophecies that might be programs, about brilliant men who felt wronged, and the elaborate revenges they might devise.
Somewhere in the house, a clock chimed 11. 1 hour until midnight, until the board might move again.
He thought about Simon's words, that believing in a curse gave it power regardless of its reality. Perhaps that was Cornelius's true genius, creating not just a mechanism, but a mythology, something that would wind through the generations like a poisoned spring, tension building until November 15th, now barely more than 2 weeks away. November arrived with frost on the windows and a telegram from Professor Aldrich that Whitmore read 3 times before breakfast. Newton papers reveal mechanical drawings dated 1692. Signature matches CH visitor logs. Your Cornelius had Cambridge connections deeper than known. Most peculiar correlations in orbital calculations. Coming November 5th to discuss. The first day of November also brought Whitmore to the sealed East Wing, Lord Harrowby having finally provided the keys with great reluctance.
"No one's been in there properly for decades," the old man had warned. "After the fire in the observatory, my grandfather ordered it closed. Said it was unsafe, but I think he was afraid of what Cornelius left behind." The corridor leading to Cornelius's workshop was thick with dust that rose in clouds with each footstep. Portraits hung crooked on the walls, their subjects obscured by a century of grime. But the workshop door, when Whitmore finally reached it, was surprisingly well preserved, its brass lock still functional though stiff with disuse. Inside was a wonderland of mechanical ambition frozen in time. Workbenches lined the walls, covered with half-assembled devices whose purposes Whitmore could only guess at. Gears of various sizes hung from the ceiling like a metallic constellation, and everywhere there were papers, designs, calculations, angry letters never sent, all in Cornelius's cramped hand. One wall was devoted entirely to clockwork mechanisms, diagrams showing increasingly complex arrangements of springs, escapements, and gear trains. Another section contained what appeared to be studies of magnetism, with detailed drawings of lodestones and iron filings forming patterns around various objects. In the corner sat a large cabinet, locked, with a note pinned to it. "For the future, when understanding catches up to imagination." Whitmore spent hours photographing everything with his portable camera, the magnesium flash illuminating corners that hadn't seen light since Victoria was a young queen. Among the papers, he found correspondence with Josiah Whitehall, the London clockmaker. The letters discussed the commission in oblique terms, referencing programmable sequences and magnetic governors that seemed decades ahead of their time. One letter, dated April 17, 93, was particularly revealing. The mechanism proceeds apace. As discussed, the activation sequence will follow astronomical timing, a fitting tribute to Newton's insights, wouldn't you say? The family shall have their prophecy, though they won't understand its true nature for generations. Let them attribute to spirits what is merely superior engineering. So there it was, admission that the board was mechanical, not mystical. Yet something about Cornelius's tone suggested more than simple trickery. This was revenge elevated to an art form, patience weaponized across a century. That evening, Reverend Dunworthy visited again,
finding Whitmore in the library surrounded by Cornelius's papers. The Reverend studied one of the mechanical diagrams with surprising comprehension. "You understand these?" Whitmore asked. "I studied natural philosophy before taking orders," Dunworthy admitted.
There was a time when I thought God's grandest cathedral was the universe itself, that understanding its mechanics was a form of worship. He traced a finger along a particularly complex gear arrangement. "This is remarkable. It's almost like a mechanical computer, designed to execute predetermined actions at specific times." "You said something about Norwich? About a false medium?" Whitmore prompted. Dunworthy's face darkened. "Yes. It shook my faith, not in God, but in discernment. How do we distinguish between genuine mystery and elaborate deception? And more troubling, if a deception leads to genuine spiritual growth, which is the greater truth?" Their philosophical discussion was interrupted by a commotion in the entrance hall. James had returned from Manchester, and from the slam of doors and raised voices, the news wasn't good. They found him in the drawing room, Lady Margaret attempting to calm him, while Lord Harrowby sat pale and trembling in his chair. "The investors withdrew," James said flatly. "Word of the prophecy reached them. Someone," his eyes swept the room accusingly, "someone wrote to them about our cursed estate. They're calling in my existing loans. If I can't pay by November 15th, the date hung in the air like a physical presence. November 15th, the prophecy's deadline, now also the date of potential financial ruin.
"This is what Cornelius wanted," Lord Harrowby whispered. "Don't you see? He's reaching across a century to destroy us."
That night, Whitmore positioned himself in the library well before midnight, but this time he came prepared. He'd brought a compass from Cornelius's workshop, and as the clock approached 12, he watched its needle carefully. At 5 minutes before the hour, it began to quiver. At 2 minutes, it swung decisively toward the spirit board.
The planchette moved again, at midnight precisely, spelling out, "7 revolutions remain." 7 days, Whitmore interpreted, though revolutions might mean something else entirely in Cornelius's mathematical world. After the others had retired, shaken by the new message, Whitmore carefully examined the floor beneath the board's table. The Persian rug was thick, but when he pressed down, he could feel regular seams in the floorboards beneath. Using a letter opener, he gently pried at one board, and it lifted slightly, revealing a glimpse of brass and the edge of what looked like a gear. The mechanism was beneath the floor, probably extending into the ceiling of the room below, a room that estate maps showed had been sealed since the fire. Whatever Cornelius had built, it was far more elaborate than a simple trick. It was a machine for manufacturing destiny, wound a century ago, and still ticking toward its conclusion. Mrs. Blackwood found him there at 3 in the morning, kneeling on the floor with his eye pressed to the gap between boards. "You'll catch your death, Mr. Whitmore," she said softly, wrapping a shawl around his shoulders with unexpected maternal care. "Some secrets are patient. They've waited 100 years. They can wait a few days more." "You know what this is, don't you?" Whitmore asked, too tired for pretense. She was quiet for a long moment. "I know that Cornelius Harrowby died bitter and alone, convinced his family had stolen his birthright. I know that brilliant men can be foolish men, and that anger can poison even the finest mind. And I know that November 15th approaches, whether we understand the mechanism or not." As she helped him to his feet, Whitmore noticed something he'd missed before. A small portrait on the far wall, almost hidden behind a curtain. It showed a young woman with Mrs. Blackwood's distinctive cheekbones and intelligent eyes, wearing the simple dress of a servant from the late 18th century.
"Your ancestor?" he asked. "We all have our connections to the past, Mr. Whitmore. Some we choose, others choose us." She adjusted the curtain, hiding the portrait again. "The question is whether we let the past dictate our future, or whether we find a way to wind the mechanism differently." Outside, the November wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in the walls of Harrowby Hall, gears continued their patient revolution, counting down to a revenge calculated with mathematical precision. The 3rd of November brought rain that turned to sleet, sealing Harrowby Hall in a cocoon of gray mist that made the outside world seem theoretical. Whitmore had commandeered the old music room adjacent to the library, spreading Cornelius's papers across every surface in an attempt to break his cipher system.
The code wasn't mathematical, as he'd first assumed, but based on astronomical positions, each letter corresponding to a celestial coordinate on specific dates. Young Simon proved unexpectedly helpful, bringing not just tea, but observations. "Mr. Whitmore, I've been thinking about what you said about earthly explanations. There's something you should know." He glanced nervously at the door. "I've been walking out with Mary, one of the parlor maids. We meet in the servants' hall after midnight sometimes, and we've heard it, the sound beneath the library floor, like a great clock ticking, but only on certain nights." "Which nights?" Whitmore asked, though he suspected he knew. "The nights when the moon is in particular phases. Mary's grandmother was a wise woman in the village, taught her about lunar cycles. She says the sounds follow the old calendar, not the Gregorian." This was the key Whitmore had been missing. Cornelius hadn't just built a timepiece. He'd built an astronomical calculator, synchronized to celestial movements. The man's ambition was staggering. A mechanical device that could track lunar and possibly planetary positions across a century. That afternoon brought Professor Aldrich himself, arriving in a hired carriage with a leather satchel clutched protectively to his chest. His wild gray hair was even more disheveled than usual, and his eyes held the fevered brightness of academic discovery. "Whitmore, you won't believe what I've found. Newton's private papers reference a young visitor in 1692, a C. Harrowby, who demonstrated remarkable understanding of celestial mechanics. Newton actually incorporated some of the boy's observations into his later work on orbital perturbations. Cornelius would have been 17, Whitmore calculated quickly. A prodigy. More than that. Newton's notes suggest the boy proposed mechanical methods for calculating future planetary positions, essentially a clockwork orrery that could project forward in time. Newton was intrigued, but considered it impractical with contemporary materials. They were interrupted by Mrs. Blackwood, who brought tea and lingered, clearly interested in Aldrich's revelations. "If I might ask, Professor, would such a mechanism require regular maintenance?" Aldrich considered this. "Any clockwork device would need winding, cleaning, adjustment. Unless," he paused, struck by a thought, "unless it was powered by something that required no human intervention. Temperature changes, perhaps, or magnetism," Whitmore finished. Cornelius was obsessed with magnetic fields. What if he discovered a way to use the Earth's magnetic field to power his mechanism? That evening, while the family gathered for an increasingly tense dinner, Whitmore and Aldrich descended to the sealed room beneath the library. The door had been bricked over, but the mortar was old and crumbling. It took only an hour's work with tools borrowed from the groundskeeper's shed to create an opening. The room beyond was a marvel of mechanical ingenuity. The ceiling was covered with interconnected gears, some as large as carriage wheels, others smaller than pocket watches. Brass tubes ran along the walls, disappearing into holes that must lead to the library floor above. And in the center, protected by a glass case that had kept it pristine for a century, sat the heart of the mechanism. It was beautiful and terrible in equal measure. A sphere of magnetized iron suspended in a framework of copper coils, rotating slowly in response to invisible forces. Around it, concentric rings marked with astronomical symbols turned at different rates, aligning in patterns that must trigger the various prophecies. "My God," Aldrich breathed. "It's a mechanical brain, programmed with astronomical data." "Look here." He pointed to a series of brass discs edge-on to their view, each notched differently. "These are the programs. When the astronomical rings align correctly, these discs engage, sending instructions through those tubes to move the planchette." Whitmore noticed something else, a small panel with a lock, almost hidden in the decoration. The key, when he tried it, was one from Cornelius's workshop. Inside was a leather journal, perfectly preserved. The first page bore an inscription: "To whomever finds this, congratulations. You have penetrated the great game." Whether you are Harrowby or stranger, know that this mechanism serves justice delayed but not denied. The journal detailed everything: how Cornelius had been cheated of his inheritance by a father who feared his brilliance, how his younger brother, Lord Harrowby's great-grandfather, had conspired to have him declared mentally unfit, how they'd stolen his designs and sold them, using the profits to shore up the family fortune while leaving Cornelius with barely enough to survive. But the final entry was the most chilling. The mechanism will deliver 13 prophecies over 100 years. 12 will come true through coincidence, careful calculation, or the suggestible nature of those who believe. The 13th, on November 15th, 1894, will seem to predict ruin, but actually reveals redemption. Hidden in the observatory ruins lies the wealth they stole from me, transformed into gold and sealed away. The board will reveal its location, but only to those who have suffered as I suffered, betrayed by family, stripped of birthright, forced to watch others prosper from their labor. Whitmore read this passage 3 times, understanding dawning. The prophecy wasn't about destroying the Harrowbys. It was about identifying a worthy heir to Cornelius's hidden fortune. But who in the household fit that description? A sound from above interrupted his thoughts. Footsteps in the library, too early for the midnight demonstration. He and Aldrich quickly climbed back up through their improvised entrance, emerging dusty and cobwebbed to find Mrs. Blackwood standing by the spirit board, tears streaming down her face. "You found it then," she said simply. "The truth about my great-grandfather." The revelation hung in the air like a struck bell. Mrs. Blackwood, Eleanor Blackwood, was Cornelius's descendant. The servant woman in the portrait, the one with Mrs. Blackwood's features, must have borne his child, a child raised in service to the very family that had destroyed its father. "I've protected this secret for 20 years, since my mother told me on her deathbed. She made me promise to see it through, to be here when the mechanism completed its century-long program." "But you could have claimed," Aldrich began. "Claimed what? Bastard descent from a man declared insane?
I had no proof, no rights, only this position earned through competence and silence, watching the family that cast out my ancestor, waiting for—" She paused, composing herself. "Waiting for justice, I suppose, though I'm no longer certain what that means." The clock chimed 11. Soon the board would move again, another step in Cornelius's elaborate revenge.
But now Whitmore understood. They weren't just watching a machine operate. They were witnessing the culmination of a century-old tragedy, a brilliance twisted into bitterness, reaching across time to settle accounts. The 5th of November dawned with gunpowder smoke from village bonfires drifting across the estate. Guy Fawkes Night providing an oddly appropriate backdrop for revelations about plots and hidden mechanisms. Whitmore had spent the previous day carefully dismantling sections of the spirit board's base, revealing an intricate system of magnetic actuators connected by hair-thin copper wires to the mechanism below. Each wire passed through nearly invisible holes drilled with watchmaker's precision. James Harrowby found him in the workshop, examining one of Cornelius's brass program discs under a magnifying glass. The younger man looked haggard, his usual composure cracked by impending financial disaster. "Mrs. Blackwood told me everything," James said without preamble. "About her ancestry, about what you've discovered. Father doesn't know yet. The shock might kill him." "And what do you think should be done with this knowledge?" Whitmore asked carefully. James laughed bitterly. 6 months ago, I would have said expose it all, drag the family skeleton into daylight. But now, I've got 3 days of borrowed money left, workers in Manchester who won't get paid if my factory closes, and a father whose heart grows weaker each time that damned board moves. He picked up one of Cornelius's technical drawings. Was he truly mad, or just too far ahead of his time? "Perhaps there's little difference," Whitmore suggested. "Genius unrecognized can curdle into something destructive." That afternoon, Professor Aldrich made a discovery that changed everything. Hidden among Newton's papers he'd brought was a codicil, a legal document signed by Cornelius's father, admitting to the theft of his son's designs and the illegal sale of patents that rightfully belonged to the eldest son. The document had been witnessed by Isaac Newton himself, who had apparently kept it sealed among his private papers, perhaps respecting Cornelius's wish that it remain hidden until the appropriate time. "This changes the legal standing entirely," Aldrich explained excitedly to the assembled group, Whitmore, James, and Mrs. Blackwood. "With this document, Cornelius's descendants would have legitimate claim to significant portions of the estate." Mrs. Blackwood stood very still, her hands clasped tightly before her. "I don't want the estate," she said quietly. "I've spent my life in service here, and that's enough." But the gold Cornelius hid, that should go to saving the family's workers, the people who depend on this place for their livelihoods. The mechanism beneath the library activated that night at a different time, 11:47 precisely. Whitmore had calculated that this corresponded to a specific astronomical alignment that occurred only once in the 100-year cycle. The planchette moved with unusual speed, spelling out, "Truth lies beneath Polaris Eye." "The observatory," James said immediately. "Polaris, the North Star. There must be something beneath the old telescope mounting." But Lord Harrowby, who had insisted on attending despite his weakness, suddenly spoke up. "No. Cornelius showed me once, when I was very young. The Polaris Eye was what he called a specific stone in the observatory floor, marked with the constellation. He said it was where true north aligned with magnetic north on the day the observatory was built. The next morning, November 6th, they assembled at the observatory ruins. Whitmore, James, Lord Harrowby, supported by Mrs. Blackwood, Aldrich, and young Simon, who'd proven too helpful to exclude. The stone was still there, cracked but intact, with Ursa Minor carved into its surface. It took 3 hours of careful excavation to reveal what lay beneath, a lead-lined chamber containing not just gold, though there was plenty of that, but something far more valuable. Cornelius's complete technical drawings for devices decades ahead of their time. Calculating engines, electromagnetic generators, designs for machines that wouldn't be invented for another 50 years. "These could revolutionize your factory," Whitmore told James, who was studying the plans with growing excitement. Cornelius designed improvements to textile machinery that would triple efficiency. But there was one more discovery. A letter in Cornelius's hand, addressed, "To my descendant, or any soul who has suffered as I have suffered." Mrs. Blackwood read it aloud, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "I built this mechanism not purely for revenge, but as a test. If you are reading this, you have proven yourself clever enough to unravel my mystery and patient enough to see it through. The gold is yours by right, but I offer something more valuable: knowledge. Use these designs wisely. Do not let brilliance become bitterness as I did. The mechanism will make one final prophecy on November 15th. It will not predict ruin, but rather offer a choice. The family that wronged me must acknowledge their crime, or the board will continue its work for another century. Choose wisdom over pride. Choose truth over comfortable lies." Lord Harrowby was weeping openly now, the weight of ancestral guilt finally understood. "Eleanor, Mrs. Blackwood, forgive us. Forgive what was done to your family." The formality that had defined their relationship for decades crumbled. She helped him to a bench, no longer servant and master, but two people bound by a complicated history neither had created, but both had inherited. That evening, as November 6th turned to November 7th, Whitmore found himself in Cornelius's workshop with Simon, who was helping to carefully pack the technical drawings for preservation. The young footman had been quiet all day, but finally spoke. "Mr. Whitmore, do you think people can escape their inheritances, their destinies?" Whitmore considered the question, thinking of Cornelius's century-long plan, of Mrs. Blackwood's patient service, of James's desperate attempts to modernize, of his own fall from academic grace. "I think, Simon, that we inherit the past, but we author the future. Cornelius tried to write the future from the past, but even his remarkable mechanism couldn't account for every variable, for kindness, for forgiveness, for the possibility that enemies' descendants might become friends." Simon smiled, a young man's smile full of hope. "Mary and we're planning to marry, with Mrs. Blackwood's blessing. She's going to train us to manage a household, not this one, but maybe James's factory workers' housing in Manchester. Building something new rather than maintaining something old." It was a small revolution, Whitmore thought, but perhaps the most important kind. The quiet overturning of established orders, the slow reconstruction of society from the bottom up. Cornelius had planned a grand revelation, but he couldn't have predicted these smaller changes, these human choices that defied mechanical programming. As midnight approached, They heard the familiar sounds from the library, the mechanism engaging, gears turning, the planchette preparing to move. But this time, understanding its nature hadn't diminished its power. If anything, knowing the genius required to create such a device made it more awe-inspiring. The 8th of November brought unexpected visitors to Harrowby Hall. 3 of James's potential investors from London, arriving unannounced like carrion crows drawn to the scent of desperation. Whitmore observed them from the library window as they stepped from their carriage, all sharp city tailoring and calculating eyes, come to assess whether the estate's troubles might provide them profitable opportunity. "They've heard about the prophecy," James said, joining Whitmore at the window. "Probably hoping to buy my factory interests for a fraction of their worth." He laughed without humor. "The irony is, with Cornelius's designs, those interests are worth 10 times what anyone imagines." But I can't reveal that without explaining everything. The lead investor, a Mr. Bartholomew Crane, proved to be a fascinating study in contradictions, a man who professed complete rationality while wearing no fewer than 3 good luck charms on his watch chain. During tea, he prodded at the family's situation with the delicate cruelty of someone pulling wings off flies. "This prophecy business," Crane said, stirring his tea with mechanical precision. "Rather medieval for the modern age, wouldn't you say, Lord Harrowby?" Lord Harrowby, who had grown stronger since the revelation about Cornelius's gold, met the man's gaze steadily. "Perhaps, Mr. Crane, though I've learned recently that dismissing the past entirely is as foolish as living entirely within it." Mrs. Blackwood served the tea with her usual efficiency, but Whitmore noticed she'd chosen the second-best china, a subtle insult that only someone attuned to household hierarchies would recognize. When she caught his eye, there was the faintest suggestion of a smile. That evening, Whitmore made another discovery in Cornelius's workshop. Hidden within a false bottom drawer was correspondence with someone identified only as J.W., likely Josiah Whitehall, the clockmaker. But these letters were different from the technical discussions he'd found earlier. They were philosophical, almost confessional in nature. "The mechanism proceeds," one letter read, "but I find myself questioning its purpose. Is justice delayed truly justice at all? Or does time transform even righteous anger into mere spite? You ask if I can stop what I've started. The answer is yes. I've built in a cessation protocol. If, on the final day, someone speaks the truth of what was done, acknowledges the theft before the final prophecy, the mechanism will complete its cycle peacefully. Pride, I suspect, will prevent this." The Harrowbys would rather face ruin than admit their fortune was built on betrayal. Professor Aldrich, who had extended his stay, was fascinated by this revelation. He gave them a way out. Even in his bitterness, Cornelius couldn't completely close the door to redemption. Or he was gambling on their pride, Whitmore countered, making the mechanism's completion their choice, not his. It's rather brilliant, actually. If they refuse to acknowledge the truth and suffer for it, they can't blame a dead man's revenge. They'll have chosen their fate. The 9th of November saw the mechanism activate twice, once at its usual midnight demonstration, spelling out 6 days hence, truth or consequence, and unexpectedly at 3 in the afternoon, when it simply moved to spell remember. This daylight manifestation occurred just as Mr. Crane and his associates were examining the library, causing one of them to actually shriek, a sound Whitmore would treasure in memory. Crane himself went pale, his rationalist pretensions evaporating like morning dew. "Electromagnetic anomaly," Aldrich said smoothly, though his eyes twinkled with suppressed mirth. "The approaching magnetic storm from solar activity. Quite scientific, really." Later, Whitmore found James in the observatory ruins, sitting among the scattered stones and studying Cornelius's technical drawings by lamplight. "I've been thinking," James said, "about inheritance, about what we owe to the past and future. My father's generation preserved the estate by selling off pieces of it, paintings, land, anything that wasn't entailed. My generation was supposed to restore it through industry, modernization. But what if the real inheritance isn't the estate at all, but the obligation to truth?" "That's a dangerous philosophy for a businessman," Whitmore observed. "Perhaps. But Cornelius's designs, they're extraordinary. If I could bring even half of them to production, it would revolutionize British industry. But using them while hiding their origin feels like perpetuating the original theft." That night, young Simon sought Whitmore out with news from the servants' hall. "There's talk, sir. Some of the older staff remember stories their grandparents told about the old Lord Harrowby, Cornelius's father. They say he died badly, raving about bronze gears and golden wheels, claiming Cornelius was haunting him through his machines." "Guilt manifests in interesting ways," Whitmore mused. "Tell me, Simon, what do the servants think of Mrs. Blackwood's revelation?" Simon's face lit up. "They're proud of her, sir. She's one of us who turned out to be one of them. But she stayed one of us anyway, if you take my meaning." "It gives people hope that birth doesn't determine everything." On November 10th, Reverend Dunworthy held a special service in the village church, ostensibly for Guy Fawkes Week, but really everyone knew about the approaching prophecy. His sermon was remarkable, a meditation on truth, time, and the possibility of redemption even for the longest-held sins. "Time," he said from the pulpit, "is often called the great healer, but perhaps it's more accurate to call it the great revealer. What is hidden eventually comes to light. What is buried eventually surfaces. The question is not whether truth will emerge, but whether we'll have the courage to face it when it does." Afterward, walking back to the hall with Whitmore and Aldrich, the Reverend confided, "I've been reading Cornelius's journals. Lord Harrowby gave me permission." The man was wrestling with the same questions that plague theology. Predestination versus free will. Justice versus mercy. Whether knowledge without wisdom is more curse than blessing. "And what conclusion have you reached?" Aldrich asked. "That perhaps the greatest tragedy isn't that Cornelius was wronged, but that his brilliance was turned inward, made small by bitterness. Imagine what he might have accomplished if that same genius had been directed outward toward the benefit of humanity." The mechanism that night spelled out its penultimate message. 5 revolutions until choice. Mrs. Blackwood was present for this one, standing beside Lord Harrowby, no longer behind him. The old man had insisted she take her place as acknowledged family, though she still wore her housekeeper's clothes. Some habits, she said, were too deep to change quickly. "Eleanor," Lord Harrowby said, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks, "I've been thinking about what must be done." "The truth Cornelius demands. It should be public, shouldn't it? Not just spoken in this room, but declared openly." She considered this. "That would be your choice, Lord Edmund. The mechanism only requires acknowledgement. The extent of that acknowledgement,
That's for the living to decide. Whitmore retired to his room that night thinking about mechanisms, not just Cornelius's magnificent creation, but the social mechanisms that had created the conditions for its existence, the rigid hierarchies that had prevented a brilliant man from pursuing his gifts freely, the pride that had kept a family from acknowledging its crimes, the patient service of a woman who knew she was owed more, but had chosen duty over revenge. The morning of November 11th brought an unseasonable warmth that made the autumn leaves steam with evaporating dew. Whitmore woke to find a letter slipped under his door, not posted but hand-delivered in the night. The handwriting was unfamiliar, elderly, and shaking. "Mr.
Whitmore," it read.
I am Josiah Whitehall's son, also Josiah, aged 73. My father died 20 years past, but left instructions that if ever the Harrowby mechanism activated its final sequence, I was to deliver certain items to whoever was investigating. I await you at the Crown and Anchor in the village. Come alone. The Crown and Anchor was exactly what one would expect of a village pub. Low ceilings, smoke-darkened beams, and the kind of stubborn persistence that had kept it in business since the Restoration. The younger Josiah Whitehall sat in a corner booth, a leather satchel beside him, his hands trembling not from age but from what appeared to be lifelong palsy. "My father was the finest clockmaker in London," he said without preamble. "But the Harrowby Commission nearly destroyed him. Not the work, he was proud of that. It was knowing what it would do, being part of someone else's revenge." He pushed the satchel across the table. "These are the original blueprints."
"The ones Cornelius gave him. But there's something else you need to know." Inside, along with incredibly detailed mechanical drawings, was a letter in Cornelius's hand, dated just weeks before his death. "Josiah," it began, "I write to you in a moment of clarity that I fear will not last. The mechanism we've built is perfect in its engineering, but flawed in its purpose. I have installed the cessation protocol we discussed, but I've done something more. If the family acknowledges their crime before the final prophecy, the mechanism will not simply stop. It will reveal the location of documents that prove my innovations could have prevented the agricultural collapse that impoverished our county. My father suppressed these innovations out of pride, preferring traditional methods. The truth I demand they speak is not just about my inheritance, but about their wider failure to serve those who depended on them." Whitehall's son leaned forward. "My father said Cornelius was dying when he wrote this, fevered, possibly delirious. But he'd already programmed the mechanism. The 100-year revenge was locked in motion." Returning to the hall, Whitmore found the house in controlled chaos. Lord Harrowby had announced his intention to hold a public gathering on November 15th to address certain historical matters regarding the family's fortune. The invitation list included the county's prominent families, civic leaders, even representatives from London newspapers. James pulled Whitmore aside. "Father's either very brave or completely mad. If he publicly admits the family fortune was built on theft, we'll be social pariahs. My investors will certainly flee. And if he doesn't, then we discover what Cornelius's final prophecy truly means by ruin." That afternoon, Whitmore worked with Aldrich to carefully modify the mechanism, not to change its program, which was beyond their ability without destroying the entire device, but to install measuring equipment that would record exactly how it functioned. For science, Aldrich insisted, though Whitmore suspected it was more for the sheer joy of understanding something so remarkably constructed.
Mrs. Blackwood found them in the sub-library chamber, covered in grease and dust, arguing about electromagnetic field propagation. "Gentlemen," she said with fond exasperation, "you're like boys with a new toy. Have you considered that Cornelius might not appreciate his masterwork being prodded and measured?" "On the contrary," Whitmore replied, "I think he'd be delighted. This mechanism was meant to be discovered, understood, admired."
It's a tragedy that he couldn't share his brilliance openly during his lifetime. That evening brought another revelation. Simon, who'd been helping to prepare the house for the gathering, discovered a hidden compartment in the spirit board's table, not part of the mechanism, but added later. Inside was a daguerreotype, one of the earliest photographs, showing Cornelius in his final years standing beside the completed board. But he wasn't alone. A young woman stood beside him, her hand on his shoulder, and a child of perhaps 5 stood between them. Mrs. Blackwood studied it with tears in her eyes. "My grandmother. And that child must be my mother. I never knew there was a photograph." "They were a family," Lord Harrowby said quietly. He'd entered without anyone noticing, moving with surprising steadiness. Cornelius had a family, even if they couldn't acknowledge it publicly. That makes what my ancestors did even worse. They didn't just steal from a bitter lone genius. They stole from a father trying to provide for his child. The mechanism activated early that night at 10:43, corresponding to some astronomical event Aldrich excitedly identified as the convergence of 3 planetary orbits. The message was longer than usual. "Truth spoken breaks the chain. Silence forges new links. Choose." "It's giving us a way out," James said wonderingly, "or perhaps a way forward." November 12th arrived, gray and misty, appropriate weather for the preparations taking place. Lord Harrowby spent the day with his solicitor, making provisions that would legally recognize Mrs. Blackwood's lineage and establish a trust for the workers at James's factory. Whether or not the public acknowledgement happened, some amends would be made. Mr. Crane and his associates had remained at the village inn, watching events unfold with the patience of vultures. Whitmore encountered Crane at the post office, sending what appeared to be a very long telegram to London. "Fascinating situation at the hall," Crane said with his predator's smile. "Whatever happens on the 15th, there will be opportunities for those prepared to seize them." "Or losses for those who mistake crisis for opportunity," Whitmore countered. Crane's smile widened. "You're not a businessman, Mr. Whitmore. You don't understand that chaos is just another word for potential profit." But Whitmore thought Crane was wrong. He'd spent enough time with Cornelius's papers to understand that the man had been a superb businessman, just one whose innovations had been stolen before they could bear fruit. The mechanism itself was proof of extraordinary project management, a 100-year plan executed with clockwork precision. That night's message from the board was simple. 3 days remain. The 13th of November saw the arrival of more guests, scholars from Cambridge, including several who remembered Whitmore from before his disgrace. They'd come out of curiosity about the mechanism, word having spread through academic channels despite attempts at secrecy. Among them was Dr. Marcus Fellows, who'd led the charge to dismiss Whitmore over the forged manuscript affair. "Whitmore," Fellows said stiffly, "I hear you've found quite the curiosity. I trust you've verified its authenticity more carefully than you did the Bacon papers?" Before Whitmore could respond, Aldrich intervened. "Actually, Fellows, Whitmore's work here has been exemplary. He's uncovered not just a mechanism but a complete record of suppressed innovations that could have revolutionized British agriculture and industry a century ago." Rather puts our academic squabbles in perspective, doesn't it? The exchange reminded Whitmore that he too had his own relationship with truth and acknowledgement, his own pride that had prevented him from fighting harder to clear his name. Perhaps Cornelius's mechanism was working on more levels than anyone had realized, forcing everyone it touched to confront their own buried truths. November 14th dawned crystal clear, the kind of sharp autumn morning that makes England briefly forgive itself for all the gray days. Whitmore stood in the library before sunrise, watching the spirit board sit innocent and still on its table, giving no indication of the complex machinery beneath that would, in just over 24 hours, complete its century-long purpose. The house was already stirring with preparations. Servants polished silver that hadn't seen daylight in decades, and Mrs. Blackwood moved through it all with the quiet authority she'd always possessed, though now there was something different. She no longer effaced herself, no longer made herself smaller in the presence of the family. Lord Harrowby appeared in the doorway, dressed formally despite the early hour. "I couldn't sleep," he admitted. "Kept thinking about tomorrow, about what Cornelius would want me to say." "Perhaps," Whitmore suggested gently, "it's less about what Cornelius would want and more about what you need to say. For yourself, for your family, for those who come after." The old man nodded slowly. "I've spent my whole life maintaining things. The estate, the family name, traditions that seemed important simply because they were old. But Cornelius, he was trying to build something new. We stopped him out of fear, I think. Fear of change, of being surpassed by someone cleverer than ourselves." By mid-morning, guests had begun arriving for the evening's preparatory dinner. The county's social elite mingled uneasily with the London journalists and Cambridge academics, while Mr. Crane and his fellow investors circled like well-dressed sharks, sensing opportunity in the very air. James found Whitmore in Cornelius's workshop making final notes on the mechanical designs. "I've made a decision," James announced. "Whatever Father says tomorrow, I'm going to publish Cornelius's innovations under his name. Let history remember him as the genius he was, not the bitter recluse we made him become." "That's admirably just," Whitmore said. "But potentially costly. Your investors will either understand the value of what I'm offering or they won't. I'd rather build something honest than maintain something false." That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor, an elderly woman from the village bent with age but with eyes still sharp as flint. She asked for Mrs. Blackwood specifically, clutching a worn wooden box. "I'm Martha Henley," she announced when Mrs. Blackwood appeared. "My grandmother was lady's maid to Cornelius's mother. She saved these, said they might be important someday." The box contained letters between Cornelius and his mother, written during his Cambridge years. They revealed a young man brilliant but lonely, desperate for his father's approval, slowly realizing he would never receive it. One passage particularly stood out. "Dearest Mother, I have made a remarkable discovery about magnetic fields and their potential for generating motive force. Father might finally see value in my studies. Perhaps he will understand that the future lies not in vast estates, but in the marriage of science and industry. I dare to hope." But the hope had been crushed, as they all knew. His father had seen only threat in his son's brilliance, not promise. The dinner that evening was a masterpiece of social tension, disguised as elegant hospitality. Reverend Dunworthy offered a blessing that somehow encompassed both Christian charity and scientific progress, while Professor Aldrich regaled the table with stories of historical innovations that had been suppressed or ignored, each tale a subtle parallel to Cornelius's situation. Dr. Fellows, perhaps influenced by wine or atmosphere, made an unexpected announcement. "I've been reconsidering the Whitmore matter," he said loudly enough for all to hear. "The evidence against the Bacon manuscript's authenticity, it was less conclusive than we presented. Academic politics, I'm afraid, played a larger role than academic rigor." The admission stunned Whitmore. Here, in this house, haunted by the weight of unacknowledged truth, even his own vindication was emerging. At 11 that night, the mechanism activated for what everyone believed would be its penultimate message. The planchette moved with unusual slowness, as if the machinery itself was tired after its 100-year labor. "Tomorrow the circle closes or opens anew." After the guests retired, Whitmore found himself in the library with an unexpected gathering. Lord Harrowby, Lady Margaret, James, Mrs. Blackwood, young Simon, and even Reverend Dunworthy. They sat in a circle around the spirit board, not touching it, but somehow connected by it. "I've been thinking about forgiveness," Lord Harrowby said into the silence. "Cornelius built this mechanism because he couldn't forgive. But Eleanor, Mrs. Blackwood, you've served this family faithfully, despite knowing what we did to yours. How?" She considered the question carefully. "I suppose because I saw you as people, not just inheritors of guilt. Your ancestors' crimes weren't your doing, any more than Cornelius's brilliance was my achievement." "We all carry the past, but we don't have to be imprisoned by it." "Yet tomorrow," James said, "we're going to publicly claim that imprisonment, acknowledge those old crimes." "No," Lord Harrowby corrected. "Tomorrow we're going to free ourselves from them. There's a difference." The 15th of November arrived with frost and brilliant sunshine, the grounds of Harrowby Hall sparkling as if decorated with diamonds. By noon, the great hall was filled with guests. Over 100 had come to witness whatever was going to occur. The spirit board had been moved to a table at the front of the room, its brass planchette catching the light from the tall windows. Whitmore watched from the side as Lord Harrowby took his position. The old man looked fragile but determined, holding a sheaf of papers that contained not just notes, but copies of the evidence: Cornelius's journals, the legal documents, the suppressed innovations. At precisely 2 o'clock, Lord Harrowby began to speak. His voice was thin at first, but grew stronger as he told the story, the complete story, of Cornelius Harrowby, genius, inventor, and victim of his own family's greed and fear. He read passages from the journals, showed the mechanical drawings, acknowledged the theft not just of inheritance, but of recognition. "My family built its fortune on a crime," he said clearly. "We prospered by suppressing innovations that could have helped thousands. We destroyed a brilliant man because we feared being surpassed by him. This is our truth, long hidden, but now revealed." The room was absolutely silent. Mr. Crane and his investors exchanged glances of calculation. The journalists scribbled frantically. The county families sat in various states of shock or vindication, depending on their own relationships with the Harrowbys. Then, at exactly 2:15, the time Aldrich later calculated, when magnetic north and true north had aligned on the day Cornelius died, the spirit board activated. The planchette didn't spell out words this time. Instead, It moved in a precise pattern, drawing the outline of Ursa Minor, the constellation containing Polaris. Then it stopped at the center of the board and began to spin, slowly at first, then faster, creating a low humming sound that seemed to come from the very foundations of the house. Suddenly, with a sound like a great clock chiming its final hour, the board split apart. The wooden surface opened like a puzzle box, revealing the mechanical marvel beneath. Gears and springs and magnetic governors, all in perfect, precious motion. And at the center, engraved on a plate of pure gold, was a single word: acknowledged. The mechanism gave one final shudder and fell still. Its 100-year program was complete. In the silence that followed, Mrs. Blackwood stepped forward. From beneath the mechanical heart of the device, she withdrew a sealed tube that had been hidden for a century. Inside was Cornelius's final message, not of revenge, but of hope. Detailed plans for schools of engineering, for factories that would treat workers fairly, for innovations that could still transform society if implemented with wisdom rather than greed. A week had passed since the revelation, and Thomas Whitmore found himself once again in his Cambridge study, though it seemed smaller somehow after the expanses of Harrowby Hall. The November rain had returned, pattering against his windows with familiar insistence, and Ptolemy had reclaimed his favorite spot atop the most important papers. But everything else had changed. The Morning Post brought 3 offers of employment from various universities, word of his vindication having spread through academic circles like wildfire through dry wheat. Dr. Fellows's public admission, combined with Whitmore's spectacular unraveling of the Harrowby mechanism, had restored his reputation entirely. He set the offers aside without opening them fully. After what he'd witnessed, returning to the petty hierarchies of university life seemed almost quaint. Instead, he focused on the letter from James Harrowby that had arrived yesterday, written in the young man's precise hand. The first of Cornelius's looms is operational. The workers say it runs like music, like clockwork, like magic. We're producing fabric of a quality I've never seen, and the workers need operated only 6 hours to produce what used to take 12. I'm implementing his other innovation. The workers share in the profits. Crane and his associates withdrew their interest, of course, but other investors have appeared, drawn by the novelty of ethical industry. Whitmore smiled at that phrase, ethical industry. Cornelius would have appreciated the irony that his revenge had ultimately led not to destruction, but to a kind of reformation. The Harrowby fortune, built on suppression and theft, was being transformed into something that might actually deserve the word fortune in its oldest sense. Not just wealth, but good fate, blessing. Professor Aldrich visited that afternoon, bringing tea cakes from the shop they'd frequented in younger days, and a proposal that had nothing to do with universities. "I've been thinking," he said, settling into the chair across from Whitmore's desk with comfortable familiarity, "about Cornelius's mechanism, about hidden knowledge, about all the innovations that might be buried in estates and archives across the country. What if we established a different kind of institution? Not a university, but a workshop. A place where historical discovery meets practical application." "Funded how?" Whitmore asked, though he was already intrigued. "Lady Margaret Harrowby has offered patronage. She says it's what Cornelius would have wanted, his suppressed knowledge leading to the freeing of other suppressed knowledge. Rather poetic, really." They discussed possibilities while the rain intensified outside,
creating that particular atmosphere of enclosure and possibility that November afternoons in Cambridge had always possessed. Aldrich had already identified 3 other estates with histories of eccentric inventors, dismissed geniuses, women whose contributions had been credited to their husbands or fathers. "History is full of Corneliuses," Aldrich said. "Brilliant minds crushed by their times, their innovations lost or hidden. Imagine what we might recover." That evening, another letter arrived, this one in Mrs. Blackwood's careful script. She was writing, she said, from the seaside cottage in Devon that Lord Harrowby had gifted her, not as servant's pension, but as acknowledged cousin, family restored. "I find myself at loose ends," she wrote.
50 years of service creates habits not easily broken. But Simon and Mary visit, they're managing beautifully in Manchester, and I'm learning to garden for pleasure rather than duty. Lord Edmund improves daily. Confession, it seems, is indeed good for the soul and the heart. She'd included a photograph, not a daguerreotype, but one of the new Kodak prints. It showed the library at Harrowby Hall, the spirit board reassembled and placed in a glass case with a brass plate reading, "The Cornelius Mechanism, a testament to genius, patience, and the ultimate triumph of truth." Whitmore set the photograph on his mantelpiece where it caught the lamplight. The mechanism had gone silent, its century-long purpose fulfilled. But its lesson continued to resonate. Time, Cornelius had understood, was not just duration, but a dimension in which justice might be engineered if one had sufficient patience and skill. A knock at his door interrupted his contemplation. His landlady announced a visitor, Simon, of all people, still dressed in servant's clothes, but carrying himself with new confidence. "Mr. Whitmore," the young man said, "I've come with a proposition. James Harrowby needs someone to document Cornelius's innovations properly, to write technical manuals the workers can understand. I remembered how you explained the mechanism to me, making the complex simple. Would you consider it?" Whitmore thought about his quiet study, his solitary work with ancient manuscripts, the comfortable rhythm of academic isolation he'd maintained since Helen's death. Then he thought about Cornelius, brilliant and alone, his isolation curdling into bitterness. Perhaps it was time to choose differently. "I'll consider it," he said. "But tell me, Simon, how does married life suit you?" The young man's face lit up. "It's like the mechanism, sir. Complex, sometimes mysterious, but when it works properly, it's the most beautiful thing you've ever seen." After Simon left, Whitmore returned to his desk, where Cornelius's journals lay open. He'd been transcribing them for publication, ensuring the man's brilliance would finally receive its due recognition. One passage had particularly struck him, written near the end of Cornelius's life. "I built this mechanism to ensure remembrance, to force acknowledgement, to guarantee that truth would eventually emerge. But I wonder now if I built a prison as much as a revelation, a 100-year cage that would trap my descendants as surely as my father's betrayal trapped me. Perhaps the greatest revenge would have been to forgive, to release the future from the past's grip. But I am only human, only hurt, and only capable of the justice my pain allows me to imagine." Whitmore dipped his pen and began to write. Not transcription, but his own thoughts, a response across a century to a man he'd never met, but had come to understand. The mechanism completed its purpose, but not, I think, as you intended. Yes, it forced acknowledgement. Yes, it revealed truth. But more than that,
It brought together people who might never have met, forged connections that transcended class and time, created possibilities you couldn't have programmed, because they required not just mechanical precision, but human choice. Your great-great-granddaughter chose service over bitterness. Your great-great-nephew chose honesty over profit. Your mechanism didn't destroy the Harrowbys. It transformed them. And in transforming them, it transformed itself from an engine of revenge into an engine of redemption. Outside, the rain was lessening, and breaks in the clouds revealed early stars. Venus was rising. Jupiter would follow. The same celestial mechanics that Cornelius had studied, that had governed his great machine. But between those fixed movements was space for the unpredictable, the human, the chosen rather than the determined. Whitmore closed the journal and prepared for bed, Ptolemy following him with feline insistence that suggested dinner had been unconscionably delayed. Tomorrow he would wire James Harrowby his acceptance, would begin planning with Aldrich their institution for recovering lost knowledge, would start the work of ensuring that no future Cornelius would have to wait 100 years for acknowledgement. But tonight, he simply sat by his window, watching the stars emerge, thinking about time and mechanism, about justice and forgiveness, about the intricate clockwork of human connection that no machine, however brilliant, could fully predict or control.
Somewhere in the great houses of England, other secrets waited in other attics. Other truths slowly ticked toward revelation. The work of discovery, he realized with satisfaction that was both professional and deeply personal, would never truly be complete. The rain stopped entirely, leaving the Cambridge streets glistening under gaslight, and Whitmore allowed himself a small smile. Cornelius Harrowby, genius and madman, builder of impossible mechanisms, had sought to control time itself. But time, in its patient way, had transformed his revenge into something larger, stranger, and ultimately more beautiful than any mechanism could contain. The future, freed from the past's rigid program, spread before them all like an unmapped country, waiting to be explored.